Some love stories begin with friendship. Others begin with a chance meeting. But occasionally, a story begins with something far stranger. A sentence spoken in a quiet room. A sentence that sounds impossible when you first hear it. And yet, years later, you realize it was true all along. For Wavinya, her story began with a prophecy she didn't believe. At least, not at first. Wavinya had always loved traveling. At 42, she had built a successful life in Nairobi, working as a tourism consultant. Her job often allowed her to explore the world while helping others plan their own adventures. Japan had been on her list for years. The culture fascinated her, the traditions, the discipline, the quiet beauty of everyday life. So when she finally booked a 2-week holiday in Tokyo, she felt the same excitement she always did before visiting a new country. Her first days were filled with exploration. Gardens, markets, small hidden cafés. One morning, her cousin, who had once studied in Japan, sent her a message. "If you're in Tokyo this weekend, visit the International Church in Roppongi. You'll love it." Wavinya smiled. Faith had always been important to her, and visiting churches in different countries had become something of a tradition during her travels. So that Sunday morning, she walked through the doors of the church. She had no idea the visit would change her life. The church service was warm and welcoming. People from many countries filled the sanctuary: Americans, Japanese, Koreans, Africans, Europeans. After the service ended, the pastor announced something. "Tonight we're having a special prayer meeting with a visiting pastor from Singapore." Wavinya hesitated. She had originally planned to explore the city that evening, but something inside her nudged her to stay, so she returned that night. The sanctuary was quieter now, lit softly by warm lamps. The visiting pastor spoke briefly about faith, purpose, and the strange ways God sometimes guides people's lives. Then he invited everyone to pray. People formed small groups around the room. Wavinya stood near the back beside a few others. Among them was a tall Japanese man she hadn't noticed standing there. He was quiet, reserved, listening more than speaking. His name was Sanada. They had exchanged polite greetings earlier in the evening. Nothing more. Halfway through the prayer session, something unexpected happened. The visiting pastor paused mid-sentence. He looked across the room, directly toward their group. For a moment, he seemed to be listening to something no one else could hear. Then he walked slowly toward them. The room grew silent. He stopped in front of Wavinya. Then he glanced briefly toward Sanada and said something that made several people blink in confusion. "I believe," the pastor said gently, "that your future husband is somewhere in this room." Wavinya froze. Her mind immediately filled with disbelief. People around them exchanged curious glances. Sanada looked just as surprised. The pastor smiled kindly and continued walking, as if he had simply said something ordinary. Wavinya exhaled slowly. "Well, that was unexpected," she whispered. Sanada laughed quietly beside her. "Yes," he said, "I think so." Neither of them took the statement seriously. Not that night. After the prayer meeting ended, people gathered in small groups to talk. Wavinya found herself standing near the refreshment table when Sanada approached again. "That was quite an introduction," he said with a gentle smile. She laughed. "I hope the pastor doesn't say that to everyone." Sanada chuckled. "I don't think he does." They talked for a few minutes. Sanada explained that he had grown up attending the church. His father had been one of the original elders when the international congregation first formed many years earlier. Wavinya shared that she was only visiting Japan for 2 weeks. Their conversation was easy and friendly, but neither of them treated the pastor's words as anything more than a strange moment during prayer. After all, she was leaving Japan soon. The idea felt unrealistic. Still, before leaving, they exchanged contact information. "Just in case you need recommendations while you're in Tokyo," Sanada said. "That would be helpful," she replied. And with that, they parted ways. Two strangers, both assuming the story would end there. Over the next several days, Sanada occasionally sent Wavinya suggestions for places to visit. A hidden tea garden in Kyoto, a quiet walking path near the Imperial Palace, a small restaurant known only to locals. Eventually, he offered to show her one of the locations himself. She agreed. Wavinya had been to many beautiful places in her life. It was the nature of her work. Planning journeys for others meant she had taken many herself. But there was something about Japan that moved differently. Slower, more deliberate. As if the country itself had decided that certain things deserved to be noticed rather than rushed through. Sanada was a little like that too. She noticed it on their first walk through the maple garden. He pointed things out quietly, the way light fell through the canopy. An old stone lantern half hidden by moss, the particular sound the leaves made when the wind passed through them. Small things dot the kind most people walked past without looking up. "You notice a lot," she said. He smiled slightly. "My father taught me to." He used to say that God hides his best work in the details. Wavinya was quiet for a moment. Then she laughed softly. "I'm going to use that with my clients. They're always rushing to the famous landmarks and missing everything in between," Sanada said. Exactly. They talked about her work, about what it meant to spend your professional life helping people discover the world, about the particular joy of watching a client return from a trip they had been hesitant about, completely transformed by what they had seen. Sanada listened with a genuine curiosity that she hadn't expected. Most people heard tourism consultant and assumed it was a glamorous but shallow career. He asked questions that suggested he understood it was neither. He told her about his own work, architectural heritage preservation, a field dedicated to protecting the buildings and spaces that held the memory of a culture. "You protect what's already beautiful," she said. "I try to," he said, "before it disappears." There was something in the way he said it, quietly, without drama, that stayed with her. A man who believed that some things were worth preserving. They walked for 2 hours without noticing. When they finally sat down at the small local restaurant he had recommended, Wavinya realized something had shifted. This was not a tourist outing anymore. She wasn't sure what it was, but it was something more than that. And neither of them mentioned the prophecy. Not yet. They didn't need to. What was forming between them was doing so entirely on its own terms. 6 months later, Wavinya returned to Japan. What had begun as occasional messages had slowly turned into long conversations and video calls. Their connection had grown stronger, more natural, more meaningful. The lanterns along the Kyoto street swayed gently in the evening air. They had been walking for almost an hour, the easy, unhurried kind of walking that happens when neither person is paying attention to the time. When Sanada stopped, Wavinya stopped beside him. The street was quiet. A few other people passed in the distance, but the particular corner where they stood felt like it belonged just to this moment. After he said the words, "Now, I think he may have been right," Wavinya's laughter came instinctively. The laughter of someone who doesn't quite know what else to do with something that feels too significant to receive quietly. But then it faded, and she looked at him, really looked, at the man who had grown up in the church his father helped build, who noticed things other people walked past, who had spent 6 months sending her messages and making video calls and asking questions about her life, with a consistency that she had tried and failed to explain away as simple friendship. When the pastor said it, she said slowly, "What did you think?" Sanada considered the question honestly. "I thought he had misread the moment," he said. "I thought it was the kind of thing that sounds meaningful in a prayer meeting and then evaporates by morning." Wavinya nodded. "So did I. But then you left Japan," he said. He looked at the lanterns above them, and the morning came, and then another morning, and I realized the thought hadn't evaporated at all. Wavinya was quiet. "Sanada, I'm not saying it was the prophecy," he said carefully. I'm saying that whatever it was, the meeting, the months after, the conversations, none of it felt accidental to me. He looked at her, and I think you already know that. She did. She had known it for weeks, possibly longer. She had simply been waiting for one of them to be brave enough to say it out loud. I came back to Japan, she said quietly. I know, he said. I didn't come back for the gardens. He smiled slowly, the particular smile of a man who has just heard exactly what he hoped to hear. The lanterns swayed above them, and somewhere in the distance, the city continued its quiet evening, entirely unaware that in a small lantern-lit street, a prophecy that had once sounded impossible was turning out to be true. 2 years later, the same international church in Tokyo hosted another special gathering. This time, the sanctuary was filled with friends and family. Wavinya walked down the aisle wearing a simple white dress. Sanada waited at the front, and as they exchanged vows, many people in the room remembered the moment that had started it all. A visiting pastor, a quiet prayer meeting, a surprising sentence spoken into the air. Your future husband is somewhere in this room. At the time, it had sounded impossible, but sometimes, God reveals things long before we are ready to understand them. And sometimes, love begins not with a meeting, but with a prophecy. Among the guests in the church that day was a woman named Mwangeli. She had become a close friend of Wavinya's through the international church community, the same community that had woven itself through so many of these stories. She sat in the second row beside her husband Hiroyuki, who watched the ceremony with the quiet appreciation of a man who understood what it meant to wait for something worth having. And as Wavinya walked down the aisle, Mwangeli thought about her own story, the prayer she had prayed in Nairobi, the rain shelter in Tokyo, the man who had said, almost too perfectly, that perhaps God enjoyed answering prayers creatively. He had been right. They had all been arranged. Every single one of them. Ida and Matthew, brought together by a dream that returned for years until the face in it finally appeared at a festival in Kyoto. Takaru and Muna, reunited across 5 years and 2 continents because a man refused to stop believing that God had heard him. Kavuli and Masahiro, 2 prayers, 1 city, 1 night, 1 answer, delivered in less than 24 hours. Mwangeli and Hiroyuki, a rain shelter, a shared prayer, and 2 years of something careful and beautiful. Wavinya and Sanada, a prophecy that sounded impossible, and a man who discovered it was true. 5 stories, 5 arrangements, all of them written by the same author. But Mwangeli also knew something else, because she had heard it from a friend, a mutual acquaintance whose older brother had recently begun spending time with a project coordinator from Nairobi, a woman named Mambua, the kind of woman who wrote prayers in notebooks and then forgot she had written them, and a man named Takuya, an architect, the older brother of Takaru, the man who had prayed for 5 years. Apparently, the Tanaka brothers both had a habit of writing their prayers down, and sometimes God wrote the answers before the questions were even finished. Because in this universe, he never runs out of stories. He only keeps writing them, 1 quiet prayer at a time. She only planned to stay for 2 weeks, but on a Sunday evening in a quiet prayer meeting she almost didn't attend. A visiting pastor stopped mid-sentence, walked across the room, and said something impossible. Your future husband is somewhere in this room. She didn't believe it, not that night. But God was already writing what she couldn't yet read. That is that God wrote this love story universe. 7 stories, 7 prayers, 1 author. Watch Story 6, The Love Story Written in Prayer, next. And subscribe to Written by Grace, because the universe is still unfolding. God is not finished writing.